Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Zach Gibson, and this is Trib Live's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. In the American latchkey era, if a child went missing, law enforcement and the local community utilized the tools of the time: milk cartons, print publications, and a community network to gain and share information to help recover the children. Time has since afforded us progressions in culture and technology that prove invaluable as tools to track and recover missing children today. Biometrics and social media are helping to locate some of the 460,000 children reported missing each year. Jack Troy is here to discuss how law enforcement hopes these advancements will aid in solving the 40-year-long Cherrie Mahan case. Hi, Jack.
Hi, Zach.
So, just briefly, before we get into the full conversation, I want you to give our readers a brief overview. We'll get more in detail. Just for now, give us an overview of the Cherrie Mahan case.
Sure. So in 1985, Cherrie Mahan was 8 years old. She had just gotten off the bus in Winfield Township in Butler County, very rural area, Corn Planter Road, actually. And that was the last she was ever seen. She was presumably abducted after getting off the bus about 100 yards from her home. And to this day, not a whole lot is known about the case. The main lead was that there may have been a van in the area with a mural of a skier on it. But even that, police, don't know for certain whether it was involved. So, for 40 years now, this case has gone unsolved. It has really captivated folks, especially because there's just so little that's known.
In the time of the case, when it happened, what kind of tools did the efforts have in the first 10 years of this search?
Sure. So after Cherrie went missing, you saw the very standard community stuff, right? You get the neighbors together, you do a search and rescue through the woods, you ask around. But in terms of national resources and tools to help find missing children, those were pretty limited at the time that she disappeared. It was only 1984 that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is still around to this day, still a big part of these searches and advocacy, started coordinating essentially the first milk carton campaign. Of course, that's very iconic. It actually only lasted a few years. And then Cherrie was actually the first child to be on a Have You Seen Me missing persons flyer. That was like kind of cutting edge at the time, around the time of Cherrie's disappearances, when there were some other cases that had inspired law enforcement, inspired these groups like the National Child Safety Council. That's actually who ran the milk carton campaign to take on these coordinated efforts. We were a long way from social media or anything like that. You did see some evening news broadcasts, including national ones, pick up the story and kind of plaster her photo wherever they could. But it was definitely not like today.
I'm sure they would have hoped to have been a very effective campaign. The Have You Seen Me mailers with information of missing children printed on them. But something that most people associate now with missing children that wasn't actually a part of the conversation at the time were Amber Alerts. Now, Amber Alerts were launched in 1996, 11 years after Cherrie went missing. Now, this particularly would have come in handy because, as you mentioned before, there was a van that was, according to the neighbors, a 1976 Dodge with a mural of a skier on the side. It was reported to be lingering near the bus stop, but even now, there's no solid link that there was ever formally established in the case. Even at the time of Amber Alert's inception, it came across over TV and on the radio. This is obviously different now. There's a lot more access to the general public when it comes to information. And in the age of information and convenience, that has a lot of benefits. So, Jack, can you introduce me to Alan Nanavati?
So yeah, Alan Nanavati is with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He spoke with my colleague Tanya for one of the two stories we actually did on Cherrie Mahan recently. And he was basically explaining how there's been an evolution over the years in the ways that investigators and these advocacy groups can get the word out about missing children. So, one example he cited was at the gas pump, right? I mean, you're pumping gas and you see a photo of a missing child go by. Obviously, there is social media. And to tie that into Amber Alerts, actually in 2015, Facebook actually implemented that within their system. So it wasn't just folks screenshotting an Amber Alert on their phone and posting it to a Facebook group. It was actually built into the platform. Instagram did that a few years later. So, there's this expansion of tools, and it's, things you would expect. Obviously, a lot of the changes we've seen in general over the last 40 years go back to social media. So it's really investigators taking the opportunities in front of them.
That brings me right into our next topic, talking about how social media and biometrics have come into the forefront to help these initiatives. Let's talk about biometrics. There has been a cultural trend. I know a lot of people have seen larger companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com become more popular over the last few years when it comes to biometric history tracing and trying to find out more about your personal family history through your DNA. Mm-hmm. Now, in your story, it tells about how something like this helped solve a case from a very long time ago.
That is correct. Yeah, it was from 1951. There was a California boy who went missing 73 years later. One of his relatives took an ancestry test and discovered that there was this big gap in the family tree they kind of couldn't explain. So it wasn't actually the missing person who took this test. It was a relative. And through, their efforts to figure this out, basically, they found this now elderly man who had gone missing as a child, and they were able to reunite with their family. So it's just a really interesting kind of case study and how genealogy technology can play a part, whether it's in a police context. I mean, when the Cherrie Mahan went missing, forensic DNA wouldn't be a thing really for another couple years. It was barely a usable kind of technology at that time. But also just, these more, I guess, casual services like 23andMe, right? Or the Ancestry DNA, I believe it was in the case of the California boy. So there's just a lot more genetic info floating around out there, both in an investigative space and in this more casual sense that can, whether it's by accident or on purpose, make a breakthrough in a case. Like the Cherrie Mahan case, I mean, frankly, at this stage, it seems just as, unlikely she's alive and well as it did for this California boy, but clearly there's, long shot miracles that can still happen through this new technology.
Now, in relation to this story, State Police Corporal Max DeLuca said everyone is testing their DNA today, trying to research their family trees. And with all the DNA genetics and genealogy today, we're hoping that we can get that one right lead when talking about Cherrie's case. So let's put away biometrics for a second and talk about information sharing again and social forums. As you already mentioned, Amber Alerts have been integrated into a lot of social media platforms, and it's the main source of information and communication for many users across America. Cherrie's school photo, as you mentioned, wasn't circulated on social media. There was no social media at the time. It was on milk cartons and displayed on TV shows like Good Morning America. Now, at that time, a broadcast television spot, especially in a news format, would have been something that had a lot of reach to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was the, dominant form of mass media at the time, and it still does have some reach, but of course it's no Facebook.
Even for Cherrie's mother, Janice McKinney, Facebook and YouTube seem to be essential for reaching out to the Find Cherrie Mahan community. She says she feels like the tips that they're getting are credible. Can you tell me a little bit about this new Facebook page, Find Cherrie Mahan?
Yeah, absolutely. It's essentially a very active community of Facebook users that have kind of come together and are looking for new clues, new leads in this case. And I do want to emphasize, too, that the state police have not closed this case. It remains open. So, new leads aren't just kind of being piled together by the family. They will ideally make their way to investigators. And so just to be clear, this is not a closed case. I guess it would be considered a cold case. But so you kind of have this online channeling of energy. Whereas before it was just neighbors. Now it's, people from all over the world can kind of fixate on this case and come up with new tips. And that's how you get the mother, Janice McKinney, saying that, actually I feel like the tips are getting better, because I'm sure that she has witnessed 40 years of not great tips. I mean, nothing has really ever panned out. And I'm sure if anyone does, she has a good sense for what has some weight behind it, and what somebody just kind of totally, threw a dart at the dartboard.
In your story, we find out that this Facebook page, Find Cherrie Mahan, has drawn hundreds of submissions in just a little over a month. And even Nanavati mentioned that when it comes to these types of cases, the more that they do with YouTube and social media, the more leads they're able to receive. Really highlighting that social media is a paramount tool when it comes to enlisting the help of the general public. Now, we've already talked about media in unconventional spaces like gas station screens. Let's talk about community forums. Tell me about Alex Minster and Trace Labs.
Yeah, sure. So this was a really interesting conversation I had with Alex about the volunteer organization he's part of, Trace Labs. They're basically a organization that crowdsources information about missing persons cases and some other cases, I believe, but they focus on missing persons cases to try to compile new leads for investigators. But they're doing it in a pretty novel way. So, honestly, like a Facebook group, that is new compared to when Cherrie Mahan disappeared. But in, I don't know, I guess modern terms, right? Like that's something that's been around for a while. Trace Labs is kind of taking that a step further, where they host these events, and it's gamified, where you're split into teams of 4 and you get points for finding different information about these missing persons cases, even producing possibly different leads. And I will emphasize too that, Alex made clear his organization kind of understands the gravity of these and is looking to sort of channel that, not to trivialize it, but because that seems to be most effective for kind of getting towards the goal. They also do these ongoing investigations with people who have expertise. So say you have a background in finance and somehow there might be financial documents tied to a case, like they would enlist people with those backgrounds then. All that's to say is Trace Labs kind of establishes these guardrails to what's probably happening anyway on YouTube, Facebook, Reddit. Trace Labs actually operates out of Discord. And so it's really kind of the next innovation. Okay, right. So everyone can connect about these cases now. But how do we do it in the most productive way is kind of the question they're asking. How do we have guardrails? How do we then condense it into a report for police like they do in about 10 paragraphs, which is hopefully digestible for an investigator who might have a couple moments, in the elevator on their way up to the office, as opposed to, their phone ringing off the hook with somebody telling them for the 10,000th time they figured out this one piece of information.
Now, that is an interesting point that is actually just coming to my mind right now, and something we're about to talk about in our next section. The culture around mystery, the culture around crime in American society is definitely playing a part in the role of the general public when it comes to solving these cases. And we'll get into that in just a second. But I want you to tell me about the case as it stands today. We know that Cherrie Mahan was legally declared dead in 1998, but this wasn't because of any key evidence or any stalling in the case.
Yeah, so again, in 1998, her family basically petitioned a Butler County judge to have Cherrie declared legally dead. And this was simply for legal convenience. I don't know a ton about the specific circumstances, but I do know it did not reflect a giving up or, like you said, a new development in the case necessarily. Where things stand today, I mean, we've talked about there's folks online who are contributing to searching for her. Her mother, Janice McKinney, is quite active in pursuing this investigation. There was a 40th anniversary event, I guess you could call it, recently. And basically, Janice helped put it on. State police were there and people came through and, heard Janice talk about the case, and they were able to make donations towards a private investigator This had actually been organized by some folks who are local, who have, devoted themselves to this case. So it's still very much active. And that's part of why this is so compelling. Like I mentioned earlier, there really have not been many substantial developments. We've had at least one individual kind of ruled out as a suspect. We've also had at least 4 women come forward claiming to be Cherrie Mahan or believing to be Cherrie Mahan. It's not always or ever somebody necessarily trying to lie to police or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it always turns out that they aren't Cherrie, they aren't related, or they kind of disappear again. So it's really a spot where not much has changed in the case over 40 years, yet we're 40 years later and there's so much that has changed with how these searches are done, and now so much hopefully that can change, which is why I think folks are staying so invested in it.
Let's move on from specifically this story and talk about the change in culture around child safety. So in your story, we meet Patty Fitzgerald, a child safety expert, who tells us that cases like Cherrie Mahan's were stuck in people's minds. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me a little bit about why?
Patty had lots of great insights we'll talk about, but I don't think it's, it takes an expert to figure out why these are such compelling cases. They are, or why Cherrie's case is so compelling and why some related cases around that time are so compelling. They often involve strangers, and they often occurred in settings not like a dark, creepy alleyway or anything like that, but in, kind of beautiful rural Winfield in Butler County. And so they really shatter, I think, people's visions of their communities and, visions of their lives in these really kind of sudden and permanent and often ways that don't result in any closure. Cherrie Mahan was, like I said, around the time a lot of these cases were happening, but things really got rolling in 1981 with the kidnap and murder of Adam Walsh. He was I believe, 6-year-old boy from Florida. He was kidnapped at a Sears, found dead a couple weeks later. There were a few other high-profile cases. And Patty tells me by 1994, the murder of Megan Kanka, and she has Megan's Law named after her, if that rings a bell for any listeners. But by then, parents were starting to actually change how they parented in response to these troubling cases. And really that accelerated by early 2000s, which is about when Patty got into the field. And so around that time, you saw the rise of the stranger danger idea. I'm 22 years old. Zach, I think you're 20, also 22. So you were probably shown a video at some point about stranger danger or something like that.
Absolutely.
It's really kind of seared in my memory. And Patty says that's actually somewhat counterproductive because while some strangers can be dangerous, it almost ignores the fact that around 90% of childhood sexual abuse in a large majority of other similar crimes against children occur from people that they know, or people that, as Patty put it, they kind of know. So say, a coach or an uncle you see a few times a year. And so Patty coined the term tricky people, which is, based on my research, caught on a little bit. I think stranger danger still comes to mind first for most people, but it's kind of this reframing of the conversation to take an approach that includes cases like Cherrie's, or includes cases like the Adam Walsh case, where they're stranger or likely, it seems, stranger focused, and kind of broadening the conversation to include all kinds of child exploitation, abduction, abuse, things like that, and hopefully, make families and also kids more aware of how to protect themselves in these situations.
Let me go for a quote that Fitzgerald added. "It's unthinkable for some parents today to let their kids off the school bus alone. When parents know better, they do better." Now, she also said that Cherrie's parents are not to blame because back in the mid-'80s, you could just walk up the hill. As we mentioned at the top of this episode, latchkey kids were the generation at the time. And during the late 70s and into the 80s, around 1 million children per year went missing, according to Ronald Reagan in a speech where he also called for media and press outlets to start using print to help gain recognition, which was the catalyst for the "Have You Seen Me" print ads. Now, taking a look at parents today versus parents back in, say, 85 when this was all happening, there wasn't as much in media to go on, and there weren't as many prevalent stories. The child abduction and kidnapping conversation didn't really nationally take stage until around 1985. And even now, we have entertainment media based around crimes. We have true crime podcasts, we have murder mysteries, and it's something that a lot of people can now attribute to a part of their personality, being interested in trying to solve those sorts of puzzles through a storytelling or narrative lens. This is probably, in my opinion, a good reason why a crowdsourcing initiative like Trace Labs is so effective. There is a much more of an audience to seek these things out now, as well as much more streamlined community or a platform to find these communities with these similar interests to help crowdsource. So what can you tell me about the Center for Missing and Exploited Children?
Yeah, sure. The Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they are sort of a quasi-governmental group. They were created through an act of Congress in the 80s, and they handle a lot of what goes on with missing persons cases. They work closely with like the FBI, and obviously they also serve an educational role. With that, there's plenty of statistics. I think one that really sticks out is, yes, you know, it was in the 80s, I think you said, but 1 million kids a year go missing. You know, that can be a very startling number, but, you know, the center says 89% of the time these cases are resolved within a year. If you think just about the missing persons alerts you see in media and newspapers like our own, you know, oftentimes we'll run something one day and the next day the person will be found, hopefully, you know, alive and well. For the cases that linger, though, that's where the maximum number of resources really becomes important. As Nanavati said to, you know, my colleague, we never give up. So the idea is this center is there for day one after a person goes missing, but also 40 years later. And, you know, as we've talked about now, it's not just them. It is kind of this whole community that's emerged around this specific Cherrie Mahan case, but also missing persons.
Okay. Well, Jack, thanks for bringing readers new information to reignite the passion for this and other cases like these across Western Pennsylvania and the United States.
Thank you for having me, Zach. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zach Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.